Hello, my name is Paul Schofield. I am from Nova Scotia, Canada. It was Christmas Day 1990, and I awoke and got out of bed. I went into the living room with my wife and Jennifer. We opened our cards and gifts, savoring the mood and feeling that Christmas Day evokes as a special holiday commemorating the symbolic celebration of Christ's birth, as well as the modern-day Santa Claus mythology that makes Christmas magical to children in our culture. We called our parents and extended family members after we finished opening our gifts to wish them all a Merry Christmas. We got ready later in the morning to go to Jennifer's sister's house. We arrived around noon and were greeted by my sister-in-law Sharon, her husband John, and their children, as well as some of John's extended family. We all sat down and drank coffee while Sharon continued to prepare Christmas dinner, which she hoped to have ready by 3 p.m. While we waited, John and I decided to run down the hallway into the store. The store was attached to the house and operated a small grocery store, a fresh meat counter, and a pizza parlor. We went there to play some of the video games in the store and then tried to outscore each other on them. I was suddenly struck by sharp pains in my chest. They were agonizing. My body became dripping wet with sweat, and according to those present, I began to turn a bluish color around my lips and fingernail areas of my extremities. John chose to assist me through the hallway and a doorway that separated the business from the living room part of the house. I slumped on the floor as soon as I entered the living room. Like dropping a bag of potatoes onto the floor is how I like to describe how I fell. That happened quickly. It was cold outside, and I was in medical trouble. And an ambulance was dispatched to the address. My wife, Sharon, and a couple of her extended family members were trying to get me comfortable lying on the floor by propping my head and putting a pillow under my neck while it was on its way. The last thing I remember is severe pain, followed by the sense of falling, and this falling sensation seemed to last forever. My consciousness was no longer inside me, but my awareness or essence was outside of my body, I realized. I was in the midst of this falling experience when, like a cork popping, I found my consciousness or awareness from a position outside of the constraints of my physical body. The horrible pain I had been experiencing simply vanished, leaving me perfectly unnoticed. I then recollect my wife and Sharon yelling, and them shaking and saying to me, "Paul, please do not go. You're slipping." Their sounds were fading and sounded echoed. I could still be aware of their presence and hear them, but their voices sounded like they were a long way away. My following realization was the oddest of all. Throughout the procedure, I became aware of being conscious outside of what I consider the physical body's bounds. Out of the sense of seeing, my eye vision was probably around 12 feet away at a 45 degrees angle from where my body was lying on the floor. I could see my wife, her sister, and her sister's sister-in-law perfectly. I also recall that I, my essence of conscious self, was flying above and away from where my physical body was laying on the living room floor. But I definitely recall that my consciousness, which was not within the confines of my physical body, was there. It was a clear impression of being able to view 360-degree all around from wherever my mind was located, while my consciousness was located next to the ceiling. While I was conscious of being out of body, I couldn't place a timestamp on it. Perhaps a couple of minutes had already passed, or it could have been 30 seconds or other variables of time in between, but it seemed like a couple of minutes. The loss of sense of time became immediately apparent, and I recollect feeling the presence of a loving spiritual entity. I believe the best way to describe it is that it felt like someone I knew, or someone who cared about me in the manner that a grandfather or grandmother would. I couldn't see him or her, but I definitely felt their presence. In addition, I felt an unseen force pulling me away from my physical body, and it appeared like I was fighting this experience. It was also at this time when the front door to the living room, the primary entry to the house area, opened, and through it came Sharon's two next-door neighbors. One was a part-time employee at the business, and the other was her husband, a school bus driver. They came to offer assistance while Jennifer, Sharon, and extended family members were caring for me while paramedics arrived. I recall seeing an ambulance attendant enter the front door with a life support kit box and another attendant, paramedic, enter with a stretcher, supported on the other end by one of the next-door neighbors. This was all happening while I was looking downward, as if I were peering through a window into the attic. Also, I recall the air being aglow, or the atmosphere being filled with all these little speckles of white light during this moment. In reality, everything was glowing or illuminating with light speckles, similar to the mirror ball lights used at dances. Even the people in the room had a tiny glow to them. They had a transparent glow to them. You couldn't see through them, but instead of being solid, they looked to have a color of light emanating from them. I recall telling myself that it seemed like I was in a state of confusion in my mind's eye, but I was completely aware that my conscious self was beyond the boundaries of my physical body, since my body was on the floor, and there were people gathered around my physical body who were frightened and upset. It was at this point that the paramedics took over from my family members who were caring for me. I recall them taking my vitals and putting an oxygen mask over my face. I have no conscious memory of what happened in the following few moments. My next recollection of consciousness, or conscious memory, occurred when I awoke inside the ambulance as it approached the hospital's emergency department. If my recollection serves me correctly, this was around 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon. I recall waking up with tremendous chest discomfort and trying to breathe. The paramedics were instructing me to breathe gently and be as calm as possible. I recall the ambulance riding over a bumpy bump as they backed up into the receiving area at the emergency department door. My stretcher was wheeled through aluminum and glass doors to the triage section, where a charge nurse took over. They wheeled me into the cardiac resuscitation room after performing a quick assessment. Soon after, interns began drawing blood from the undersides of my wrists to obtain an arterial blood gases sample, as well as inserting an IV in my other arm. The oxygen was transported from the small portable tank to the in-hospital source of oxygen via a mask placed over my face. While they were working on me, the staff was advising me to stay cool, and I recall them asking Jennifer questions about my age, medical history, symptoms, drugs I was currently taking, and other pertinent information. The staff now had my medical chart, and they noted that it had been around 1 year and 2 months since I underwent major thoracic surgery to my esophagus, which was also performed at the same hospital approximately 14 months prior to this day. The doctor was chatting to my wife and asking me questions at the same time, while I was still drowsy and in tremendous agony in my chest, though it had lessened since I had recovered consciousness in the ambulance. A little time later, a doctor arrived with the findings of my blood gases and instructed the nurses to start a heparin drip immediately. I was still sleepy at the time, but I recall the doctor telling the nurses and my wife that my blood oxygen saturation was about 63%, which was significantly below the standard 97 to 99% percentage they prefer to see. The team jumped into action, running off EKG strips. They had me sign a consent document and were getting ready to inject me with an anti-clotting medicine. They believed it was necessary, yet if I had internal bleeding any place in my body, I may have died. Nonetheless, they advised that the benefits of this clot-busting drug outweighed the risks, so I agreed to the IV injection. I recall the doctor telling my wife and staff that with my O2, oxygen level, at 63%, and blood gases so low that I shouldn't even be cognizant or awake, and because I had a history of pulmonary embolism, I was most likely suffering a recurrence. On this Christmas Day, they diagnosed me with blood clots in my lungs, based on how the symptoms manifested themselves and how my vitals and symptoms had changed over the previous hour. The symptoms appeared suddenly. I was lying on the stretcher, aware that if any more clots entered my lungs at this time, I would die. The staff had no idea how near I was to death because I had not told them about my out-of-body experience that occurred about 30 minutes before. The hospital professionals informed my wife and family members that when blood gases are that low, some individuals do not survive, and they were shocked that I was even conscious. When the coronary care unit was completely filled, they had to admit and transfer me to another hospital. Another 2 ambulance workers arrived within an hour and did the same thing. When I arrived, I was taken to the 3rd floor intensive care unit. That too was full, so they readied another room next door to the ICU and placed me in a room with 3 other patients, all of whom had major heart problems. The hospital had a nurse assigned to our room 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. During that night, another doctor arrived. At the time, I was also attended to by an intern and 2 other doctors. They were unable to take me down to nuclear medicine to get my lungs scanned because it was Christmas Day. However, based on the arterial blood gas numbers, my medical history of recurring blood clots since 1984, and my vitals that day, they were certain that pulmonary embolism was the cause of this medical crisis. They put me on an intravenous drip of heparin, anticoagulant, and put me in bed. I couldn't get out of bed for the next 7 days. My vitals gradually recovered, and on January 3rd, 1991, They took me down to nuclear medicine to have my lungs scanned again. The anticoagulants were working, and I was beginning to recuperate from the clots. Nonetheless, my hospital stay was lengthy, lasting until about January 21st, just under 4 weeks. This Christmas Day experience would forever alter my life. Having a conscious remembrance of being outside of my body was a profoundly spiritual awakening event. I felt completely at peace and a part of the cosmos. There can only be one explanation: a blessing. As a result, life changes began on this day that have spiritually matured me to where I am today. Watch this near-death experience next about a man who saw his grandma in heaven. What he was told was simply remarkable. You don't want to miss it.